Okay, Josh Farley, and when he's over the bridge, then many other sheep will follow.
So I'm actually very interested in the role of business in addressing ecosystem services. I look at ecosystem services as primarily public goods. So they provide benefits to everybody, and it's the role of the public sector. I also look at businesses, and using Shell as an example, apparently there's the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez in terms of oil spills every year in the Niger Delta. Oil companies spend less of their money on R&D than almost any other sector of the economy, about 0.03% average of their sales. And they've played a huge role in convincing people that ecosystem services don't matter. For example, in the United States, there's been this huge emphasis, the oil companies have really convinced Americans that climate change is not happening. So I'm curious to what extent, oil company, or I'm sure it's just business in general, is going to be a viable part of the solution, or whether we really should be relying on public sector to address public sector problems, which requires a transfer of resources from the private sector to the public sector. And that's, I think, it's partly to Myko, but it's kind of to everybody, is a general, to what extent can we rely on the private sector to provide public goods?
Okay, Myko, can you maybe start? Hit the button and the light should turn on. And yes.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Not an easy question, I guess. Again, I think from my experience working with various different companies, more and more are actually looking at, as part of their CSR or part of their social license to operate, etc., that they do have a responsibility to, to secure the public goods, even though they cannot cash in on them. So I think it is happening. But at the same time, I absolutely agree that regulation is key, and it is not the business of the private sector to deliver public goods. They produce private goods. Yet you have to acknowledge that through their operations they will impact the public goods. So what is their mandate and response in that? I think varies across sectors as well. I've seen companies that are what I would call high sort of dependent sectors, the agriculture, the forestry companies that are actually looking at pricing their products to incorporate some of the public goods. So they're stacking stuff onto just the value of timber. So that plantation management of how they do that, they stack on carbon, they stack on some of the watershed services. So I think a lot of companies are looking at that, if it is actually possible, if they provide public goods, to cash in on that somehow, or if it just sort of gives them a competitive advantage and helps their social license to operate, helps them get the permits they need, etc. In terms of climate change, I think, Shell, they've been quite advocate for actually having a global price on carbon and things like that. So I'm not sure everyone sort of shies away from it. And in the U.S., I believe a lot of the energy sector have actually pushed for, a climate deal in the U.S. But the ones that I know from my work with WBCSD, they were actually advocating for it. Duke Energy and some of the other big ones.
Okay, thank you, Myko. Anybody else in the panel? Yes, Hank and Laura. In that order, Hank.
Yes, I think you should also look at other businesses, for instance, in the agricultural sector. Unilever has just published a strategy earlier this year pointing out that they want to go to 100% sustainable resource in 2020. Also, DSM is a large company producer here in the Netherlands, producing antibiotics and intermediate chemical products, and they have shifted their whole resourcing to natural resources, and they are very well aware that if they don't source these resources in a sustainable way, they will be out of business in maybe 20-30 years, and that is the driving force. It's self-interest of those companies. So they see that their resourcing has to be sustainable, including biodiversity, in the long term. And for strategic reasons, they choose now to make their whole resourcing sustainable, including biodiversity. And both companies are on the top of the Wall Street Sustainability Index, and I think that are the front runners. Let's be honest about that. But there are an increasing number of companies realizing that, and that's self-interest of those companies, and that will drive them to go up.
Thank you, Henk. Laura.
Yes, I think nobody disputes that ecosystem services provide primarily public goods, and there's no question that the primary source of financing will be the public sector. I think what we're talking about now is additional funding from the private sector on top of this mostly public funding basis, because there are some private benefits that private companies could be interested in investing in, and I'm sure, I wasn't here in the first few days, but I'm sure there were several examples provided, like water purification that might be interested for water companies, flood control for insurances, etc. And there's a few instances of that sort of partnerships developing in the UK, for example, but also elsewhere in Europe, although at this stage they're very isolated. But what we're saying now is that there could be some role in the public sector for brokering some deals or encouraging them, knowing that there are very few instances where the benefits are purely private. So we're probably talking about public-private partnerships here. So that's for the incentive part, if you want. But there's also more indirectly a role in terms of putting maybe additional responsibilities on businesses based, at least in the EU, knowing that in the EU legislation is based on the polluter pays principle. So if we did identify that there were some gaps and there was a need for additional legislation, that's an indirect way of financing, of putting additional constraints on businesses to compensate for their impacts. But that's a different strand of logic.
Thank you, Laura. By now you've all been able to read the summaries that Dolph made, a wonderful contribution, and that probably prompted the first one. I see a lady there, very well, and then Sander. Oh. Okay, Rosie, and then we'll go to the...
Oh, okay. Just to add to the discussion from an NGO perspective, CI has a very large group that works, it's called Center for Environmental Leadership and Business, that works primarily with the private sector and corporations. And a lot of the goals of this group of people is to work with these companies to minimize impact and avoid the impact to begin with, minimize and then offset impacts. We do have tools that we developed with them, for example, to avoid siting in areas that are of high biodiversity value. This was explained a little bit earlier. But we also work, I think the reasoning also is the scale, the magnitude that some of those companies will have when they change, the impact that it will have when they source from sources that are more sustainable. I mean, like one of the companies, for example, is Walmart, and we oftentimes get criticized by working closely with them. But can you imagine the magnitude of the changes when Walmart makes a change that involves sourcing from a completely unsustainable source to a more sustainable source? So there is basically the rationale. But I agree that because many of the ecosystem services are public goods, public institutions would have to take the leadership.
Thank you, Rosie. The lady with the black and white shirt whose name I don't know.
Thank you. My name is Lina Gorson. Thank you for the presentations. When I read the question, what needs to be done, I think that every consumer has a huge impact on the future, and that what matters a lot for consumers is status. So my question is, how can we make a sustainable lifestyle more sexy for the consumers?
Who's your question directed at?
Well, anyone that wants to respond.
Okay, then Christo maybe to begin with, and then Willem and Rick maybe.
I'm going to respond from a national perspective from South Africa. And I've just, before I came up here, or a few weeks ago, we had a launch of an investment made by one of our banks, Nedbank, of 9 million rand into water balance. There are some services that are more sexy to business than others. In a water scarce country, maybe not the tropics and those kind of places, but the water scarce countries like South Africa, Australia, and some of these other places, water is very sexy for business. And you know, we very often use the elephants as the pragmatic species. In those kind of cases, water tends to be a very sexy thing for business. What I would like, while I've got the chair, I just want to mention something. All the businesses that we are mentioning here are all very long established big businesses. They're well known household names. I've mentioned it last week as well. They are the emerging giants from the developing world that nobody knows about yet. How are we going to get ecosystem services on those agendas? I don't know. But they are emerging giants. There's some of them in South Africa. There's lots of them in other parts of Africa and the East, South America, which we don't know yet. The Walmarts of the future, the Shells of the future. Who are they? How are we going to get on the agendas? I'm asking a question from the table.
Oh, that's a nice setup for Willem, I think. That's a challenge for IUCN to find out.
Let's answer that question then first, and then I will come to the question of the lady in the room. I think maybe you've read an interview, I think it was a few months ago in The Economist or in Time magazine on it was an interview about of CEOs all over the world, what their biggest worries were, and nature and ecosystem services or ecosystem biodiversity loss and so on was number one, especially of the CEOs in Latin America first, then Africa, and then Asia, and then North America and Europe. So the CEOs of those companies, those new, maybe you could say those newcomers, are very much worried. That maybe has to do with the fact that they are more connected yet to nature. That's my analysis on this topic. So I'm quite optimistic, and I think I have to push optimism a bit here again in the room, because and then back to the lady's question, sustainability, lifestyle, and so on. From the European and from the Dutch perspective, you see that cradle to cradle and ecological products and so on is becoming sexy. So and this is going to be developed further. Of course, it's a cooperation. It is a push and pull between NGOs, consumers, business, and government. But this is becoming sexier, and also people, especially young people. I see we have a movement of young professionals in the business of 350 people, and I'm very happy to see that there are quite a lot of young people here. They are growingly becoming aware of this fact, but. We have to push this forward and come with good examples. And in my presentation, I made a blunt statement. Maybe it's not on the slide here, but that is, let's make businesses the drivers behind ecosystem restoration. That is my message. We need to completely make a new, 180 degrees difference of where we came from. We need to make the polluters the champions of the actively restoring our planet. It is a challenge for NGOs, it is a challenge for scientists, and it is a challenge for a lot of businesses who are not aware at all of this. And what we've learned is that if we have a peer-to-peer discussions between business, so put 20, 30, 40 companies in the room and explain them the 10 difficult problems of our planet, the planetary boundaries issue, they will come up with solutions. And we will, as NGOs and scientists, provide them with our work, how we can help them with these solutions. But I think that is what we need to do. And governments then will follow, because they always will follow.
That seems like a nice step up for Professor Rick. Teach those business people what's all about.
In principle, if you look at the consumers, they are a very important part of the whole scene, but they are not the only part. So if you can change consumer behavior, fine, but it's extremely difficult. If you take the positive ads against a lot of other ads, then the time difference is enormous. So if you look at some of the science within IHCP, the Human Dimension program, where the balance is of changing that behavior towards a much more sustainable behavior, that can be done, but cannot be done without the producers. So the industry, the financial sector has to be on board, and governance has to actually set a level playing field and provide the right incentives to move towards that much more sustainability. And governments are enormous consumers themselves, so they can actually provide a big example of sustainable consumption. So in principle, if you look at the science, it's all actors have to work together, and it's not only the consumers.
Thank you. Sander Jacobs, in the middle there was the first, and then Bob Costanza, and then the lady 2 rows in front of Bob, and there's a guy on the right there, spotted. What's the left side of this room doing?
Thanks. Hello, I'm Sander Jacobs from the University of Antwerp. I have a question for Henk. So we saw really positive presentations and evolutions this morning. So in the private and in the policy atmosphere, going towards a sustainable future, which is really nice. However, you will all have to admit, or we all feel that mainly the political side of going towards a sustainable future requires a lot of government intervention in the market. At the same time, we have a global evolution, and also in the Netherlands we have an evolution towards a more neoliberal and liberated market, avoiding a lot of governance from different societal levels. So to make my question really concrete, what do you think is the future of regulations in obtaining a sustainable future?
Maybe Laura can prepare also what to...
Now, I think we are coming at a moment in society where you have to rethink the balance between what governments and international institutions can do and what business and other parts of society can do. And the climate negotiations have shown how difficult it is to come to a multilateral agreement and find the money for new multilateral actions. And my personal opinion is that a new doom story about biodiversity will not work in this kind of world, and especially not when we have also an economic crisis. So we have to challenge the world with a new perspective, and I think green growth can be that new perspective. But that not only requires a revision of the way how we organize our economy and how we resource our materials, but also it requires a rethinking of the way what is the responsibility of consumers and private business and NGOs. And what we are experimenting here in the Netherlands with, and ICN plays an important role there, together with the organization of companies, VNO, which is the big organization here, national organization of all private firms. And they are taking up initiatives to a number of initiatives to start that rethinking process. And I'm very happy, for instance, there is now an agreement between VNO and ICN, and Willem can elaborate on that maybe a bit, to have a platform, biodiversity of business, which is shared by the former chair of Shell, the just retired chair of Shell Netherlands, Rijn Willems. And they are starting a community of practice between business, no net loss. And I think that are the things, and it's just emerging. And I think we have to stimulate that, to facilitate that, and we are now in a phase that the forerunners in the business community are on that track. So from a government perspective, we have to facilitate that, take away legal restrictions to go into new ways. For instance, I just got a phone call a few days ago from Natuurmonumenten, which is here the largest nature conservation organization, and they made an agreement with DSM, the other company, which are called, that their products, the wood and the reed which they take from their reservations, that DSM is going that as a resource for their production. So it's that kind of initiatives you have to stimulate in this phase, and then we have to help the main companies, and in the end, I think the free riders, you have to finish off with legislation. But we are now in the starting phase of a new kind of policy development.
Thank you, Henk. Before I ask Laura to comment on this, I've really spent some time reading the new biodiversity strategy of the EU, and my impression is they switch between the carrot and the stick approach. They indicate that they really expect things from the member states, but they also offer a lot of help. So that's apparently the new attitude. Is that correct, Laura?
Yes, I think that's a good analysis. I just wanted to react first on the role of government. I think it's very clear that for biodiversity, as we said, and ecosystem services provide mainly public goods, and they're very strong market failures. So the rationale for public and government action is very strong, and I don't think that's changing. But what is true as well is that you need a buy-in from all parts of society. And one of the criteria that when we analyzed the failure of reaching the target, the 2010 targets, was the lack of ownership for the 300 and however many actions there were in the Biodiversity Action Plan for 2010. And that's something we want to avoid for this new strategy. So it will be, for us, it's very important to involve all the different actors and different parts of society in implementing the strategy, and there is a role for everyone, from businesses and from civil society. And that will be done through the common implementation sector framework. Sorry. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Bob Costanza.
Hi, Bob Costanza from Portland State University and the Solutions Journal, and this is maybe picking up on Josh's comment and what I see here as Rick's summary, that we need, new institutional platforms and governance structures for ecosystem services, and the idea of expanding what you might call the common sector of the economy as opposed to the private or the public sector. And one idea for doing that is this idea of institutions around common asset trusts. The state of Vermont actually has a bill pending in the legislature to create a common asset trust in Vermont, and there have been suggestions to make an atmospheric trust, an ocean trust. So, and the idea here is to be able to implement some of the property rights laws that we have, but assign property rights on behalf of communities rather than on behalf of private individuals, and then be able to charge those who damage the asset and reward those who enhance the asset, and better govern, I guess, these common property assets that we're talking about. So I think we need new institutions like that. I know there's several variations you can probably think of, but I'd like to get the panel's response to that direction. Would businesses be in favor of setting up a trust around these assets and being able to then both contribute to and be charged for damages to those assets?
Thank you, Bob. Anyone in particular, or the whole panel? can I? Yeah, I see Willem and Rick reacting. Well, Willem, please.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good remark and observation. Bringing it back to reality is of course the fact that all the international institutions are under stress. The whole world is in a you could say in a crisis. Also around international institutions, not only the IMF, but also the European Union or the United Nations, etc., etc. But I fully agree that we need to bring these kind of new institutions, a kind of new way of thinking in the international world. I just gave an example to bring the World Business Council together with ASEAN to form a new institution where we can make a kind of broker between businesses and local communities and NGOs around ecosystem restoration and validation of ecosystems in the business, to make that connection. But I also know that also in ASEAN, and I cannot talk about the World Business Council, are they have their problems and are not always as strong enough to do this. So the question is, how can we identify the enthusiasm and the positive energy to really create these new things? And I was just thinking about, that's why I've mentioned Steve Jobs, who died yesterday. I think this guy did something, he brought something new, completely new, in his world of IT and business. And what he did was that he created a new market of consumers who wanted to use a computer for new things, and not as a computer where it was used to be. So this would be an invitation for some people to think about the right buttons for business, consumers, and NGOs and governments to create this new initiative. But I fully agree. I think we need this as soon as possible, as we need to accelerate and scale up.
Thank you, Rick.
I think we have to recognize that the world is very fluid. The institutions we have are not cast in stone, but they change dynamically because of response to crises, response to different developments, etc. And I think the development of these common assets trust is a very, very good example of actually dealing with the commons. And I think there are other examples within the scientific literature, within the science domain, which actually show that it is possible. For example, that Lina got the Nobel Prize 2 years ago on actually how to manage public goods was a major milestone in actually putting that both on the political agenda and much more on the scientific visibility. Now, if you read the blogs on her Nobel Prize by the traditional economists, you really would... No, don't continue. But it's that kind of discussion which is extremely important there. And if you look at the new sustainability initiative of ICSU and its alliance partners, there's also quite a lot of discussion on actually how to do that. What kind of institutions are needed? UNEP is very strong in that discussion, just published a report on the green economy, and UNEP as such is much further ahead than a lot of the science. If you search for green economy in the ESI database, you get 5 papers or something with green economy in the title. It's not an integrated issue within the scientific domain, but the Rio Plus 20 conference next year in June very much focus on that. So the discussion is taking off, and I think some of the science is a little bit lagging behind, and we really should change that considerably.
Thank you. Very stimulating there. The lady right in this row. Can you get them? No, this young lady here.
Well, this young lady is Louise Wilme, Institute for Environmental Sustainability. I was wondering, because the last couple of days we've heard quite some different methodologies and approaches and almost beliefs on how to understand this ecosystem services, how to put this into practice. So there's actually quite a lot of diversity and pluralism in science. I was wondering how people that actually have to implement it, I'm talking about policymakers and everybody there on stage, how can you actually deal with all this diverse ideas coming from science? Is this something good? Is this something bad? How do you approach this?
Okay, any volunteers on the stage here to take up? Okay, Myko can start off, the others can think about it.
Yeah, and I think, as I said in my presentation, that's one of the biggest challenges that a company like Shell, for example, faces, with operating in more than 50 countries, 100,000 employees, is since there is no global standard around these things, how do they actually sort of in a systematic and robust way do that across the board? That's extremely difficult. And I guess it's a natural sort of evolution of science that first you bit all over the place, and then you sort of through the funnel you get the things better aligned. But right now it's very difficult for business to pick one methodology and run with it, because there are so many out there. So I think what business is doing right now is basically trying to find out themselves, what does this potentially mean for us, and then just track the developments to see what's happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Laura, please.
Yes, I think there's a need for some sharing of good practices and analyzing the diversity, maybe making recommendations, but it's difficult to be too prescriptive, because these different methods are useful in different contexts, so there's not one approach that can fit all the needs. And to give the example of ecosystem assessments and this section in the biodiversity strategy about mapping and assessing ecosystem services, valuing them, etc., what we're doing is to launch a study to look at good practices in all the EU member states and also on international level, to try and make recommendations to the EU member states who haven't started doing this yet, and give some sort of guidance, but without being overly prescriptive, as I said, because there are different ways to do it, and there's not one way that is better than others. I think that there's probably recommendations in terms of good practices and what works in certain circumstances, but not one answer.
Okay. Then there was a next question. Yes. Okay, we'll take that, and then the man with the beard behind. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Bas Verschuren. I work with Earth Collective and also on a voluntary basis with IACN. I look at cultural and intangible values and how they're being accounted for within ecosystem services approaches. And the question which struck me is like, how do we all really connect to nature? How do we connect to nature beyond being a consumer? And are we getting those values, those deeper values that really move people to make decisions about their environment? Are we really taking them on board? Are we also, as scientists, asking the critical questions whether we are being inclusive enough in the way that we're developing our theories? This has been also the topic of our special session last Tuesday, and we had very lively discussions. So one thing that stood out for me is that how do people really connect to nature? What is their deeper motivation?
Okay.
And are we getting that on board? How do we do that?
I think you've made a point. And by the way, the reporting back on the special sessions is this afternoon, so you'll get another chance to elucidate. Who feels connected here? Willem.
Very briefly, just some experiences about how we as scientists and NGOs try to establish a link with the private sector in the Netherlands over the last few years. Actually, we didn't start with talking. First of all, when we went to businesses and also to the chairman of the Dutch Association, Dutch Confederation of Industries, a very powerful person. I personally didn't go there with the message, it's all doom and gloom. It's the planet is going down. First, I always started with a personal talk. So I asked them, "Do you have children? How are you? Where are you going for holiday? What is your driver to do the job you're doing?" And that's how we started with our Leaders for Nature business platform. We started first of all on an individual basis, and then slowly moved to a company basis. And I think we also explained that sustainability is not about the 3 Ps: planet, profit and people. It's about the 4 or even 5 Ps, and planet is not part of that. Planet is the basis. So you have planet, and you have people, profit, pneuma, which is the soul, you could say, and pleasure. And that's a better entrance to motivate people and to really talk about, okay, but how can we work together to solve issues? Because it's all about solving issues. And then you could say, a new way of thinking pops up. And that's maybe an answer to your question. It works. And there are a lot of management theories about it and so on. But it works to, first you have to connect to the people you try to reach out. And then you have to identify these issues where you connect him or her with your motivation to connect it with nature. I hope it's an answer to your question.
Sustainable pleasure. Huh. Anybody else here on the panel? Yes, Rick. Rosie, what's CI's view?
That's my own view.
I think the whole discussion on cultural values goes back to intrinsic value as well. And goes back a little bit to some of the discussions we had on ecosystem services in the Millennium Assessment. And remember that the first paper with ecosystem services in the title was 1983, a paper by Ehrlich and Mooney in Bioscience, and they used already the intrinsic value debate and very strongly supported it, and ecosystem provide us with services which you actually depend on. It took 20 years to actually make that very much into mainstream discussions. If you look with the intrinsic values, yes, that has been extremely important for all nature reserves and protected areas in the world. But that's only 10% of the land surface and 2 to 3% of the ocean surface. So that's a very small part. The rest we people are managing and using. So the ecosystem services are important there. The cultural values are actually part of that ecosystem service. A lot of aesthetic, recreational, etc. So very much like Willem said, you have to recognize that, and that's one of the major advantage. Last week we had an inaugural lecture of one of the Wageningen professors, Caroline Kruse, and she was actually talking about the different dilemmas in environmental science. And the people, planet, profit, and I like the pneuma and the pleasure very, very much to edit, was one of those dilemmas. Because it's not so much the discussion that we are driven by things. No, we also make choices. And choices is much more the economic view of things, so you try to optimize the different choices. But what Caroline did in her talk was actually showing the, which relates to a paper by Fischer and Will Steffen in Transient Ecology and Evolution, where there were 3 circles. The outer one was planets. Planets set the boundary conditions for the people, and if there are no people, you don't have profit. So profit was very much in the middle. And it really shows, by putting them together, it shows the dependence. Well, a lot of discussions in parliaments or in newspapers is the people, planet, profits are 3 balls which you jiggle, and if it's becoming a little bit difficult, you put 2 on the sides and you jiggle with 1, which is much, much easier. With 5, it's probably, if you can handle it, you really have pleasure. But so what Caroline did was then actually changing the sequence. There are certain worldviews of people who actually put planet in the middle, then profit, and then people on the outside. And it's the different discussions on worldview, where you put your values, which values are actually most really strongly relate to those cultural values. And they should be very much in the middle for ecologists, but they are not always in the middle for certain consumers or right-wing politicians, etc., etc. So there is where the discussion should be.
Thank you, Rick. Rosemary, would you like to comment on this, personal or CI?
No, just to say that since we more or less came up with a new mission that is more encompassing of ecosystem services, we have defined a number of securities through which we're going to work. And one of them is cultural, together with food, health, climate, water, and biodiversity as well. And the way that we are so far working with that is through the work we do with indigenous communities around the world. CI has a long history of working with traditional people which are often disenfranchised, which are often struggle to get access and right title for their lands. And so this has been so far very successful. For example, with the Kayapó region in Brazil, we have a very strong partner, Kayapó tribe in Brazil, we have a very strong partnership that allows for the enforcement, because it's 11 million hectares, and the southern basin, in the southern portion of the Amazon, which is subject to tremendous, encroachment. So working with them, working with this community and other communities, allows for this tribe to preserve, to continue to preserve or conserve their areas. So this is just one angle through which we are working with it.
Thank you. Henk.
Very short. Rick's circles brought me to remember something Herman Mulder, a former chief risk analysis of ABN AMRO Bank, said in Nagoya as a member of the steering board of TEEP. He said, no planet, no people, no profit.
Okay. Marta, and do I see more fingers in the air? Hands in, yep. And okay, Marta.
Marta Perezova from Alter.
Oh, jeez, I'm so sorry.
Yeah?
I passed over the lady there. Okay, Marta, go ahead, Marta, and we'll...
Okay. I will be short. I was wondering, very clear, there is a role here for private sector. But if I look around in this conference, there are very, very few ones. Could you raise up the hands, the private sector? Okay, so I was wondering why, and I was thinking, I think it's a very nice idea, this Steve Jobs that died yesterday. He had a big impact, and I think it's because he understood the needs of people, but not only that, he made something that it was really nice to look at and was friendly. I mean, it is, if you think about the inside, it's very ugly, but when you have an Apple computer, and this is not making propaganda, easily you feel warm feelings about this, and I was wondering, what's our gray, our way of talking? Why are we not yet attracting to this private sector?
Willem. Christo, are you moving?
I think you said something very important, and you said that Jobs was good in making something beautiful. And maybe you've heard that I said that companies should be the driver behind restoration, not behind conservation. There's a difference. Of course, conservation is very necessary. We know the Nagoya outcome, 17% should be conserved on the terrestrial and 10% marine worldwide. But businesses have another driver. They want to do something, action. They want to create something. And they, in general, as Steve Jobs did, want to create something to make it more beautiful and handsome, something you like to have. So I think, therefore, that restoration is the way forward, because you make something beautiful for businesses. So if you want to buy them in, you need to go for that track. Then conservation will follow. So that means for scientists that they need to provide businesses with the right tools to make it beautiful, with native species. And for NGOs, it means that they need to provide businesses with the right communication between local communities and their needs, and the tailor-made work they do in all those countries. For governments, that they take away the wrong subsidies and give the right legal framework. And that is what I call the new mantra. That's what I call the new way forward. If we don't do that, and we are forced to do it, because now the international institutions are in a state of a very sad state, we will need those new institutions who can deliver those you could say, those new challenges. And we are very happy that we are entering a very heavy crisis a social crisis, a disemployed crisis, a financial crisis, an ecosystem crisis, a climate crisis, and so on. And so we are very happy to see that all those crises will create an enormous opportunity to come to these to deliver this outcome, because this crisis has also something to do with the people minds. Because of the people like Steve Jobs, people are now interconnected. You know, in Burkina Faso they know how to live here. So if you're poor there and you are an entrepreneur, please come to the Netherlands or to Western Europe, and they are coming. And you know the law of entropy. They will all come to Europe or to from Mexico to the United States, to the richer countries. People know how we live here. So that is a complete social change what has happened over the last 20, 30 years due to television and internet. So I really think it's about making things better and more beautiful. And now I think I'm quoting a kind of an old Dutch company like Philips, but that's about it.
Thank you, Willem. Christo, and then I apologize again, and we go to the lady on the right side of the room. Let's not forget that.
Marta, I think your question has taken me back a little bit earlier on, what should we focus on and how should we approach it. I've got a very strong feeling of opinion about focusing in on specific ecosystem services. You spoke about Steve Jobs that gave something beautiful to the world. And then sort of going back to cultural services, cultural and recreational services, that's something beautiful. And I don't think we specialize on the individual services enough. We flabbergast the general public with ecosystem services, and they say, oh, what's this? A miner was sitting next to me at the meeting last week, and he said, it's a bunch of regulations that you want to force onto us again. And what we need to start doing is start focusing on the tourism services, on the water services, on the different things, and make them beautiful. That's my opinion. And so specialization. Caroline and I've spoken about that yesterday, and she's now going to.
Thank you very much. Please identify yourself so I can apologize one more.
Sorry. My name's Caroline Sullivan, and I'm from Southern Cross University in Australia. I've got a simple question which really is for everyone, but is focusing around the point attributed to Rick on the screen there. I think one of the main problems that we have in mainstreaming this whole concept of ecosystem services relates to the fact that we do not have mainstreaming of ecosystem services economics or ecological economics in mainstream economics departments in training of our economists. So it's actually very, very difficult to find economists who are even interested to think about this. And I would like the panel to suggest, especially those of you involved in government, how you think we can address this serious issue of the fact that ecological economics and ecosystem services are actually treated as marginalized aspects of economics. Thank you.
Right in my heart. Well, we have a new journal. Who will take up this globe? Professor Rick, to begin with, and Rosie, yes, please. Laura.
I think that's the view of 5 to 10 years ago. I think it's changing very, very rapidly. If you look at programs like Biodiversity, there are 60% ecologists and biologists and 40% economists discussing the different issues and making the connections. If you look at many universities, they have centers for Earth System Science, centers for Earth System Science and Sustainability at the moment, and they take a much, much broader look, and there are also quite a lot of economists and political scientists involved. So I think it's changing very, very rapidly at the moment. But the mainstream economics faculties at the different business school still provide curricula which are outdated, and we have to change that indeed.
Okay, Rosie.
Oops. I've been hanging out with all sorts of economists lately, and including environmental economists, traditional economists, ecological economists, And so what I hear oftentimes is that the ecological economists kind of preach to the choir, and the message remains pretty much insulated in this community. And then when I talk to environmental economists, it's like, well, the real economists being the neoclassic economists, don't really pay attention to what we say, because we really haven't come up with standards or ways that we can measure. And that's especially important for what I'm involved now, which is national accounting systems, which is more macroeconomics. So I think things are changing, and the fact that UN Statistics Division is really taking the leadership in coming up with some minimum standards to incorporate natural capital and specifically ecosystem services into ecosystem services, even if it's in a pilot phase initially, and by 2012 they should release a report, is already a major step. But I think the bottom line is, for us to get the message across, we really need to talk to finance ministers and those people that are involved in statistics, divisions of governments, to get that and to really demonstrate that this can be done, and to collectively, hopefully, eventually, come up with the standards that are well accepted, as are the standards for GDP, for example. So it will take time, but I think we have already started. Slowly, this thing is moving.
But we get old and we are impatient. Laura, please. She was trained, as I said, by one of those early ecological economists that came from environmental economics originally. He may not even like it that I'm calling an ecological economist.
No, that's okay. But it wasn't that early, but but early enough. I would agree that things are changing, and certainly the Commission has recruited a few environmental economists in the different DGs, so that's helping to change things. And I think what's difficult is to mainstream the idea of biodiversity itself in the different sectors. That's quite difficult, because people just understand it as species and habitats, who don't really see the relevance and the benefits. And for me, that's the main value of the concept of ecosystem services, is if you can make people understand what it is, it's easier to mainstream. As I said, in the current discussions, we're really feeding this in the debates of the reform of the next sectoral policies. And I think it's also true to say that currently a lot of people in the different DGs, at least we're trying to feed in these ideas, don't understand what ecosystems are. We've had a hard time in the discussions on next budgets to make DG budget, for example, understand what we were after, but we're making progress. I think it's quite promising. Same thing in development policy. They were really wondering what we're talking about in terms of innovative financing instruments for biodiversity. What do you want to do with birds, migratory birds? But that's the only thing they could think about. So yes, there's quite a lot of work to be done on this, and I think the TEEB report has been really useful for that. And certainly in the next few months, one of the concrete actions that we want to do is to make TEEB representatives make presentations and explain what this is all about in the different DGs in the European Commission, so that might help a bit.
Thank you. Hank was there, and then I'm going back to the last questions. We're running out of time. Hank, please.
Yeah, I recognize the point you raised when I've talked for the first time with the chief economist of the ministry. He said to me, "You're thinking Malthusian," and I wish I had the state of mind to answer him. If you think exponential growth is possible always, then you are either a fool or an economist. But I think you should, now the serious part of the answer, I think you should also look at at what places are economics who are wanting to listen to listen to this message. And they are in the risk assessment departments of the bank and the rating agencies, because they see that if in long-term investments resources are limited or becoming scarce, or prices are volatile, are going up, then that is an economic risk for a business. So what you see is that the big rating firms are looking at this, and I hear that from the chair of one of the largest institutional investors here in the Netherlands, with 100 billion of euros to invest. For instance, Walmart has made a sustainability policy under pressure of a Nordic assessment agency. We said you are vulnerable. So, and also, if I talk to the big banks here in the Netherlands and the retailers, they are looking at risks, and those people are vulnerable for or are open to the message that we are going into a serious risk.
Thank you.
That's the way to convince.
That's correct. While most politicians in the U.S. denied climate change or man's role in that, the insurance companies were very much aware of that and adjusting their insurance policies very clearly in those areas where damage was expected. And one more, there's a multitude of material. I was just joking about this journal because it's not there yet, but ecological economics has been on the scene now for 20 years, 21 years, and so there's a curriculum, easy to fill with material, books around, so nothing should be stopping the universities in the world of starting to make some serious ecological economics curricula. But I shouldn't be advertising this stuff. I'm the chairman. I had one more question from the gentleman there in the middle. Please identify.
Hello, I'm Jeroen Arends from Wageningen University. This one is from Myko. I see that big companies are interested to participate as well, and I'm sure you have good intentions. But sometimes I have the impression that big companies are taking over the vocabulary. They talk the talk and they do a bit of the walk, but it seems window dressing. And your core business is providing energy and providing petrol. I put some of your petrol in my car, and I'm a polluter. But I rather put hydrogen in my tank or methane or whatever. And so I think maybe you should focus more on changing your core business and then also try to avoid these consequences like you see in Africa with the land grab. So that's my question to you. What are you doing about changing your core business? Thank you.
Myko. Now remember, he's seconded at Shell, huh?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately quite removed from the sort of strategic decisions of Shell. But I think, you know, what I hear within the company when these issues are discussed is that, you know, a lot of, basically, you need all the different types of fuels as part of the energy mix, right? And what my colleagues tell me is that it'll take, say, 50 years to supply 1% of the energy need in a new technology. Yeah. So clearly, there is going to be a high demand for oil and gas in the future. One of the shifts that Shell is embarking on is moving more towards natural gas, which has a benefit in terms of CO2 at least. They are still involved in biofuels. They have a big biofuels project in Brazil. But yeah, I mean, Shell has made a strategic decision that they will not become wind energy. I mean, that's not going to be their core business. Their core business, what they're good at, is going to be extracting oil and gas. Yeah.
Anybody else on this? Otherwise, we're going to wrap up. Okay, Rick, last comment from the table.
I'm a little bit disappointed that one of my students drives a car, because we really try to teach the Wageningen students to use their bicycles, which is fully emission-free. And I think, of course, we can do an awful lot here if we travel in Wageningen. And Leon already mentioned that I travel quite a lot. All our travel is carbon neutral. So by force, we invest, etc., etc. Those are indulgences. I know the limitations of those kind of things, but it's still, I think it's important to actually show that you take the examples of your own behavior, very much like the first question by you.
You.
No, not Josh. Lina, I think it was the name. So it's bringing that together. It's closing the circle again towards the consumer, towards our own behavior. And companies can help by providing the right products.
Thank you very much, Rick. I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks the panel very much for your elucidating answers. Thank you for the questions.